Bonjour, je m'appelle Tim Messerschmidt, je suis de PayPal, and that's it. As I said, my name is Tim Messerschmidt. I'm running the European Developer Relations team for PayPal and Braintree. In case you didn't hear about Braintree yet, they are a really cool payments company running payments for companies like Uber, Airbnb, Slack. So if you ever used those guys, you probably used our services as well. And well, today I'm going to talk about passwords and my eternal hate for passwords, for bad login experiences, for user authentication. And I do have some thoughts on this topic, so don't take this too serious. And let's see how far we go. I guess we leave up to 10 minutes for QA. So if you have anything, try to note it down. Either I answer it in advance or we go through it in the QA. And I'd love to start with a very simple question. Do you guys actually believe in security? Hands up, like if you believe in security, if you think it's still a concept that exists. One guy, two, three, four. That's a great percentage. I think we have like 4 out of 100 or something. Great. So obviously nobody believes in security nowadays except 4 guys, because security is something that is obviously desirable, but it's very, very hard to get to something that we could consider secure. We see all those kind of leaks of passwords, we see hacks, we see all those issues like recently with Gmail. So lots of people run into issues like, how do I actually authenticate my users? How do I store passwords? Where do those data files go? And usually when I give a speech, I like to start with a very simple story. It's a story about passwords, and there is this consultancy, Skull Security. And Skull Security is basically always analyzing password leaks. So whenever a company like Adobe or Sony or somebody else is being hacked, and you see those awesome links on Hacker News with a pastebin link that contains hundreds and thousands of passwords, they go through those documents. They do some data crunching, and they look at popular passwords. And they try to find out how stupid are users. And it turns out they are quite stupid, sadly. So did you know that nearly 5% of all users use the incredibly secure password? If you're one of them, please leave the room and change your password now. Kudos to you. All right. So obviously, that's one of those things where you say, that's old people, that's people that don't really care about their data. So we believe humanity cannot be that dumb, right? We believe that they are being smarter and that they change their passwords and they see all those news about all those awesome hacks. So let's assume they are being a bit smarter. Turns out they are not. So 8.5% of all users use password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So still kind of sad. Okay, that's now the 2 easiest passwords. But it's getting even worse. You have nearly 10% of all popular user accounts at popular services with password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now obviously you guys might think, well, but I don't have the email address, or I don't have the login. But who in this room has an email address of his company with something like firstname.lastname@companyname.com? So think about security. So the sad thing is obviously, it doesn't really stop there. If you have a list like these top 1,000 passwords, you can probably get up to 91% of all accounts. And you might think that I'm lying. I'm sadly not. 79% still top 500. So you take 500 passwords in this list, just throw it at a bunch of different accounts, or you come up with those accounts, you do some social engineering, you do some brute force, and nowadays cloud computing is incredibly cheap, as Microsoft told you already. So there is a high chance that people can access your data, right? The first time that I saw those statistics, I looked kind of like that. I was incredibly shocked, right? I had this huge faith in humanity. I studied computer science, so I was in my tiny computer world. I read all those cool blog posts about secure passwords. And everybody told me, you know, you have to generate your passwords with exclamation marks and question marks. They have to be 16 digits. You have to not be able to memorize them. So secure they should be. So I obviously lived in this bubble, but lots of people don't live in this tech bubble. They don't understand what's going on. Now, CBS News is a quite huge news station, and they analyzed 2013. The data I showed you before was mostly to 2012. So 2013 was the year of Adobe being hacked, and I'm not quite sure if you guys remember that, but it was an incredibly huge list, not just 5,000 passwords and accounts, not just 10,000. I think it was roughly 150 million user accounts, and that's a lot. So let's see how that affects the top 20 list. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 made it past password. So didn't really change too much. And now we see creative ones, like number 10 is Adobe 123. I wonder where that comes from. I love you seems to be very popular. We see monkey. I can absolutely appreciate that. Let me in Photoshop. I wonder why. Then we have shadow and sunshine. It seems like people are getting more depressed because sunshine went 5 down. And admin, also incredibly popular. Now, every time that I look at these passwords, and I actually check those lists out quite a lot, I always think, who creates those passwords? And then so obviously, we all agree, right, that this could be improved. And it is up to us as developers and as services and as companies to make this better, to help our users, to take them by the hand and make sure that they actually don't run into these guys with horrible passwords. So, did you ever try out Have I Been Pwned? It's a very cool website, haveibeenpwned.com. You enter your popular usernames or email address, click on Go, and you can actually see how many services included one of your accounts. And if you see your account in there, probably it's time to change your password. So after my speech, during the lunch break or something like that, just give it a try. It's actually frustrating. So the huge problems that we all face are actually kind of simple. Passwords are being reused. You already saw those lists. They are being phished. PayPal is a very popular phishing target. Lots of people get those emails. We don't send those emails, so please don't trust them. And keyloggers are still a problem. You might think it doesn't really affect us because all of us run fancy Macs or a Linux system or Android or whatever. But there is still this user group using Windows and a lot of other operating machines that are not really secure. And they don't really use antivirus, and they don't update their antivirus definitions. So we have to protect them, right? Who of you watched Lord of the Rings? Especially the first movie. First movie, Lord of the Rings? So do you remember Gandalf at Moria, where he tried to get into the dwarven realm of Moria by standing in front of this door? Now the issue is, to give you a bit background for those that didn't see the movie, is the dwarven door of Moria is protected by a spell, and you have to say a certain word to get into the door. So classical password situation, right? Now the issue is the door is open for just 1 day, and Gandalf, obviously, is being an old wizard, he forgot it. So he starts the first dictionary attack. So can you imagine the same happening with a hacker and your account and these lists? It's actually incredibly easy. Now, another movie example. Star Wars fans in here? Come on, give me a hand. All right. Did you ever wonder why R2-D2 always manages to open doors at the Death Star, manages to use the elevators, manages to open the tractor beam, all these kind of functionalities? The Empire simply didn't hire security experts. So obviously that doesn't help as well. And now we are always being faced with this one myth that passwords have to be very long, that they have to use symbols, digits, characters in funny orders, so hard that you can't memorize them. And one of my favorite sites, XKCD, made this comic. It's actually really, really popular. Lots of people might have seen it already. And they basically analyze how secure this password is compared to Corrector's battery staple. Turns out, 4 very simple words that you could probably remember can be more secure than this password above in the upper left. So should we always use those passwords? Obviously, yes, it's better than password. But always consider, if you're not using a password tool like 1Password, that these easy functions, like coming up with 4 random passwords, can actually be helpful. And there is actually this really cool library for a lot of different frameworks and a lot of different backends called the XKCD Password Analyzer that does exactly this. So we all agree that security can be painful, and sadly not all people know about it. I read a lot about in the Smashing magazine, and I saw this one random quote by a random guy saying, if you favor security too much over user experience, you make the whole experience in general a pain to use. And I guess all of us would agree. If I have to enter this incredibly long password, and it's maybe so hard to remember that I cannot really come up with it just out of my memory, and if you want me to authenticate with 3 more security questions and all those kind of things that make sites secure, it's obviously a pain to use your service, especially in mobile apps. Nobody loves to enter data in mobile apps. Now, a very simple way to improve user experience is something that comes from the Nielsen heuristics. There is this really smart researcher called Jacob Nielsen, and he came up with 10 different metrics that vastly improve user experience in desktop apps, in mobile apps, in web apps, in any kind of application. So one thing he says is, you should allow users to see their input. So obviously, if I enter a password and somebody stands behind me, I might want to have a masked password, like on the left side. But if I'm standing here on stage and nobody's watching me and nobody's standing in my back, shouldn't I be able to see what I just entered? So you might say, well, obviously this is not a big issue because I can type amazingly fast on my keyboard and I'm always correct, but not everybody is. And if you enter a wrong password and you click on send or log in or submit or whatever, and it was the wrong password, it's incredibly frustrating. Now, if you look at mobile, we have this big issue. Somebody's sitting in a train, he has a bad connection, the train is shaking, he might be walking. He's very likely to have a false input. So it's very nice if you give him the chance to verify his input before you force him to submit this stuff. So you can improve user experience with a tiny thing. Android allows that incredibly easy. Now, there is this really cool library from Robert Audio, Password View, and it looks kind of bad on my slide, but it's basically a GitHub project. So it's open source, you're free to use it, and what it does is it provides an edit text field with a strength indicator for your passwords. It allows to check if it should be visible or not. So it comes with a lot of those best practices for you. It's easy to implement it yourself, but obviously since it exists already, it might make sense to use it. Now, I said basic authentication using passwords is most of the time a big pain. It's easy to use. You usually pass a header in your requests. You encode the password in base 64, which may not be mistaken as an encryption. So you do these things, and that's it, right? But where do you store those passwords on your device? How do you take care of that as a developer? On iOS, they have this great concept of a keychain, and it works incredibly well. It's actually really nice. It's synchronized. It's pretty cool. On Android, we have similar things, but most of them are not as great yet. So most developers on Android go the easy way, and they use shared preferences. Who's storing user credentials in shared preferences? Okay, a few of you. Now, who is using MD5 to encrypt the passwords in there? Did you know that MD5 is not that secure yet? So there are actually cool alternatives to do that. There's this really cool library called Secure Preferences, which is a wrapper around shared preferences, and it's using SHA-1 as far as I know. So it's getting a bit more secure without you really have to think about the security. And then there is a cool database called SQL Cypher, which is basically, I would say, a module around SQLite that encrypts all user data. So it's getting incredibly hard to access user data. And it basically comes for free. It works on iOS, on Android. It's encrypted with SHA-256, 65. So it's incredibly secure, and it's for free. It's open source, so use it. And now, obviously, you guys might say, so what, right? I'm talking here about killing passwords, and all I do is talking about how bad they are, but I don't come up with alternatives. Now, a big issue is a lot of people forget passwords, right? Especially if they are secure. Obviously, there are those users that are using 1Password. I'm one of them. People use LastPass and KeePass and a lot of other cool tools, but those are heavy users, and we can't always just consider them. Now, there is this consultancy, Blue Ink, which made one of those surveys in 2011. They surveyed, I think, roughly 666 users, which is an awesome number. And they found that most of those people are just likely to leave your service, your app, if they forgot their password. They wouldn't even bother to enter their secure answer. They wouldn't really fill out any profile emails. They probably took a wrong email address and just entered fake details into account creation. And then we obviously had this big issue. I guess all of you know this logo by now. So on April 7th, a big vulnerability in OpenSSL got public. So secret keys on OpenSSL are possibly compromised, and that allowed to read the memory of the systems that are affected. That means all your passwords could have been invalid, compromised. So for me, April 7th looked probably something like that. I got an email from my friends at LeapMotion. I got an email from Slack. I got an email from Wunderlist, from V6 Wunderkinder, from IFTT, and a lot of other services. And I guess all of you had a similar experience on April 7th and 8th. At least you should. And obviously, this leads to this big issue. Once passwords are stored, people always need to update those things, because you should update your password every 3 to 6 months and so on, right? And your company might enforce that, but lots of other services don't. There's this really cool tool, 1Password Watchtower, which I always recommend to anyone. And those guys basically come up with a list of services, and you just enter any service, and they tell you if it got hacked or not. Again, very useful. And if you know 1Password, they are now deeply integrated in iOS with their new version. What you can do is basically say, hey user, if you're using 1Password, you can just use your credentials in my app using their extension. Now the issue is we're speaking here Droidcon, right? So I reached out to those guys, and they promised that they are going to work on it soon. So 1Password users, rejoice. There might be an extension, an SDK for you soonish. Well, bottom line is obviously passwords suck. I think we can do better. And gladly there are alternatives. So which tools does the internet provide to us? Which tools do we have in order to improve user experience? I guess right now my most popular thing to use is passwordless authentication. And there's a bunch of different ways to handle that. Some of you know Facebook Connect and all those different methods that basically lead you to another installed app. They send you an email, they send you a text message, and it's incredibly easy to realize. So is your service really in need of passwords? Can you just skip that? Can you make your user authentication much easier by just providing tools he has already? I think so. Nobody really enjoys entering data on mobile phones, as I said. And now you have this issue. If you ask him to come up with an email address and a secure question so he can reset his password, and maybe he has to enter not just one, but another one and another one, the user might either drop or just enter fake details. So assuming we use different accounts or other mechanisms, we have two very simple email tools like SendGrid or MailChimp or Mandrill. There are a lot of those services, a lot of those startups which allow you to send transactional emails. Same with text messages, Twilio as an example. So you use those services, and what they do is basically they send you a link to authenticate. And we should all assume you are hopefully all using two-factor authentication on Google Mail. So if your Google Mail account is secure, why don't we just shift the security from your app into Google? Because they obviously have much more time to fix security issues. They will update their service. So if we use two-factor authentication or passwordless authentication, we can end up with something like that. This is Startup Digest. They send you, I think, a weekly newsletter containing lots of cool event links. And they just send you an email to any kind of email you specified. So you get that email, you click on that link, and you actually see it looks a bit like OAuth. They provide a user token in there, and this randomized token is valid for, let's say, 24 hours, 12 hours, 2 hours. So you use your phone, you log in over there, and that's it. No passwords. Incredibly easy. Same actually with Slack. I had to change my password over there recently, and they said, you know what, I know that passwords are really a pain to enter, so why don't you just click on this one link, and it logs you in on your device. So they provide a way to skip the password. They don't remove passwords in their service, but they allow you to skip them, which is very nice, because obviously on your PC or Mac or whatever you're using, it's much easier to enter a password because you have a keyboard than doing so on a phone or a tablet. Now, if you're familiar with PayPal's experience, we also ask users to enter an email and a password every time he's supposed to pay. Turns out we actually removed that feature. We have now a new functionality called One Touch, and I was incredibly happy when I saw this blog post. So my company, Braintree, being part of PayPal, said, why don't we shift the security into the PayPal app that users are maybe using on their phone already? And only if they don't have the PayPal app installed, then we can ask him to authenticate. So we can basically check those things and see if the user is authenticated in one way already, why don't we use that mechanism instead of another one? And you can easily do so with Google Plus or Facebook or any other service. And when I saw those news, I looked something like that. I was incredibly happy. I could watch this for hours. Now, two-factor auth is incredibly easy to realize nowadays. Google Authenticator is something that is open source. There are a lot of libraries for your service to use. There's also an alternative for those of you who might not really like to use Google Authenticator called Authy. And they leverage SMS, email, or some of them even hard tokens. Now, we run into another issue. Lots of people don't realize that there's a difference between authentication and authorization. So authentication means I want to give you access to resources, to maybe my images on Flickr, or maybe to profile information, but I don't want that you necessarily know me. I don't want to identify myself. So we can stay anonymous, and we basically skip login, right? And there is this incredibly popular technique for that called OAuth 1. And OAuth 1 got designed in 2007 by the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Lots of smart people in there, like lots of Googlers, employees of eBay and Yahoo, and lots of other companies. Well, the issue is developers really hate it. Who has worked with OAuth in this room? Just OAuth 1. Who liked it? Same here, I just hate it. So the first time I had to fiddle around with OAuth was back then when I wrote my bachelor thesis. So I thought, well, it's just another library. It's incredibly easy to use. So I checked out the documents, and then I ran away. I really felt like crying for like 2 days or something. I had stomach ache, and then I was incredibly aggressive. So back then, I had to implement against Mendeley. Mendeley is a service for researchers. And it turned out they didn't really use the standard. Because it turned out OAuth didn't really tell you how to implement it. It was a draft that basically said, this is how it could go, but it didn't really tell you how to implement that stuff. And they had this really cool thing called the OAuth dance. User authentication in simple 8 steps. So I'm not going through the whole thing over here, but all of them that ever, like every developer that ever had to deal with this really loved it, I promise. Now, sadly, there is a big issue. OAuth 1 is not secure. The way that the authentication usually works is you get a token and you say afterwards, after the user authenticated, please redirect them to a certain service, like my login page. Turned out you could just define any login page, any redirect URL, because it happened in the second step, not in the first step. So they came up with OAuth 1A, and it was a bit like putting lipstick on a pig. It was not much better, but at least it was kind of secure. And if you have ever dealt with upgrading OAuth mechanisms or dealing with various implementations, you will see all of them have different ways to do so. So this image is Indiana Jones with the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Indy has this big issue. He needs to replace the gold idol, seeing on the right, with a bag of sand. The issue is he doesn't know how heavy the bag of sand is and how heavy the gold idol is. If he replaces it and it's not heavy enough, he dies. And well, that's how a lot of developers felt when dealing with OAuth. Good thing is there are libraries to help you, so you don't have to fiddle around with timestamps, with encryption, with all that stuff. Bad thing is they are still just taking care of client side. So if your app tries to implement OAuth on server side, good luck. Now the good thing is they came up with OAuth 2, and the main framework got published in 2012. So they knew that there are more scenarios for authentication. There are new device form factors. There are a lot of new devices. And it's actually really easy to use. So they looked at the OAuth dance and tried to make it simpler. So instead of having 8 steps, it's actually 6 kind of useful steps, with the 6th step already getting data. So that's actually kind of cool. They have 3 different tokens in there, one for authorization, one for the access to data, and one to refresh other tokens. And it's actually very easy to use. So anyone used OAuth 2 already? Who liked it? A few more hands, at least something, right? So when I saw OAuth 2 coming up, I was actually kind of happy. At least client-side, they fixed a lot of issues. So I think it's a way that we all should go for. Obviously, it really depends on the services that you work with. And a lot of services are still heavy pushers for OAuth 1. So if you have to implement OAuth 2, it's actually super easy. As I said before, it's actually like with basic authentication. You can pass a header, and that would be the authorization flag. You just pass the bearer token, that's it. Very easy to do. Or even easier as a URL parameter. So what I showed you with the Startup Digest email, they use exactly that mechanism for that. Now, if you have to deal with OAuth 2, most of the time, a lot of services don't provide an actual SDK to do so. So you have to use web views, and then you have to change your manifest and say, whenever a custom scheme is being called, then redirect back into my app and back and so forth. Gladly, there are libraries to help you with that. So Scribe is actually pretty cool. It's a very nice and flexible OAuth library. And then there is Postmanlib, which is a wrapper around Scribe, which handles a lot of the web view stuff. OAuth 2 is far from perfect, especially client-side. There's a lot of attack surface because people don't really specify how to make it secure. But client-side, it's actually very good to use. I like it. There is this one blog post I have to talk about, which is OAuth 2 and the road to hell. And one of the guys, having worked on the draft at IETF, Aaron Hannell, actually wrote it. So Aaron was not really happy about OAuth anymore, because they had OAuth 1, which was a big Frankenstein construct. And they realized it's really difficult to use, and everybody had its saying in how the draft should look like. Well, and then OAuth 2 turned out to become exactly the same thing, plus being just a blueprint. So OAuth 2 might not be the best thing. And a lot of companies actually do the one mistake. They combine OAuth with identity, which is not maybe the best way to do so. So if you consider identity, there are three things that are being used right now. OpenID, OpenID Connect, and Persona, or you might know it also as browser ID. So these standards are really about saying who you are. It's about your identity. And the issue in the internet is obviously you can pretend to be anyone, right? And your users can pretend to be anyone. So how do we make sure that the data that they provided to us kind of makes sense? Now, OpenID was meant to be the standard identity in the web. It got defined in 2005, so you can imagine the tech was not too great. And now in 2014, they actually shut down the biggest identity service called myopenid.com. So let's skip my OpenID and myopenid.com and so on. Browser ID, well, the issue is it comes from Mozilla, and they try to do the same approach. One central ID service didn't quite work, so they said everybody becomes an ID service, like Google Mail can be an ID service, and you use those existing accounts again. But it's not really defined which data you can access. So how do we combine authorization and authentication? Logging in and also providing valid data. One way would be OpenID with the OAuth hybrid extension, but as I said, OpenID is a pain to use. And another way would be OpenID Connect, which is heavily based on OAuth 2, and it actually really sees a lot of those advantages, like providing login in a nice way, logout in a nice way, refreshing tokens, getting actual data. So I think it's a really cool draft. You should check it out. And now, obviously, there are also different identity providers. Twitter, Google+, all those different ones, Facebook, PayPal. So how do you choose them? And now it really comes up to, do we want to deal with a very serious use case? Or is it a game, or a new music app, or a new camera app? And do we even need those services, right? So we should always ask users, which service do you want to use? And a lot of people tend to be very focused on one or two. On Android, you're obviously very likely to have people using Google+. On other platforms, they might be using Facebook. On other services, they might be using Twitter. So we should offer them a bunch of different ones. We shouldn't just always go for one service and just that one. So I don't think we should always take one. And you have a choice. Those are actually, right now, the most 4 popular ones, including us. Yay. And now, if we discuss different data, it comes down to what do you want to access? Do you want to have the friends list of somebody and what he likes? Facebook obviously makes sense. But do you need his address, his date of birth, or his language? Then it might make sense to use PayPal. So you should always consider those things based on your use case and not just go for one standard because you did it before. Now, this is an incredibly messed up slide. What it says is, people like social sign-in. Actually, 66% of a surveyed user group prefer single sign-in or social sign-in over regular password flows. And it's actually kind of common, right? Because especially on mobile, again, you have Facebook installed, you have Google+ installed, you have PayPal installed, all those services that you might use. Why should you enter a password again? So obviously, we should go ahead, right? Now, yesterday we did the app clinic over here, and we've been analyzing a lot of apps and gave some critics on mostly login pages. And a lot of people use user authentication and login pages as an artificial fence. They keep users out. So who requests users in this room to log in before he can use the app? Just anyone? Okay, that's actually pretty good. So the issue is, if you request the user to log in before he actually sees what your app offers, he's actually likely to leave, especially if he doesn't know your app, if he doesn't know your service. So think about ways that you can actually preview what your app does, or maybe even allowing to use the app without login, except he wants to share stuff. So think about ways to actually enhance user experience before we keep out users and before we require him to log in. And really think, do you really need those profiles? Do you really need his email address? Not every time that's the case. So to give you a sneak peek what's coming up, Bluetooth Smart or low energy is a standard that isn't just emerging. Everybody has it nowadays in his Pebble smartwatch, in his Google Glass, in a lot of different devices. Also, fingerprint is becoming accessible. Now, with fingerprints, we obviously have the issue, is a fingerprint actually the identity of a user or a password, right? We only have 10 fingers. What is when your fingerprint is being compromised? Do you want to cut off one finger and just go ahead with 9? So we have to think about ways how we leverage those new ways as developers, like fingerprints. Touch ID is now accessible in iOS 8. I'm pretty sure once Google releases a certain fingerprint feature outside of Samsung, that they are going to offer it as an SDK feature. So think about how do we use fingerprint in a sensible way. As I said, there is the Pebble smartwatch. Fitness bands are becoming incredibly popular. Moto 360 and all those cool Android Wear devices. Most Google I/O attendees have one. Google Glass, another Bluetooth Low Energy device. And this guy, NIMI, which is actually measuring your heartbeat and identifying you through different patterns. So all those Bluetooth Low Energy devices exist in your environment. So Google actually announced at the Google I/O keynote that Android L allows to tap into those devices and skip authentication. So they did a demo where they could actually use the Nexus that they had on stage to skip authentication with a Chromebook. You could do the same with your glasses and your watch. If my glasses and my watch are being connected to my phone, it's very likely that I'm actually holding my phone, right? So we can actually skip a lot of user authentication with it. So they call that a trusted environment. And obviously it allows to scale security based on the use case. If I go to Starbucks and buy a coffee for $5 or something like that, it might make sense to make it very easy and accessible. But obviously if I buy a new TV or a new phone, I might want to still enter a new password or something on top. And that's something, as my last talking point, that the FIDO Alliance is working on. A lot of different companies are in the Fast Identity Online Alliance, like Lenovo, Google, PayPal, BlackBerry, Motorola. A lot of those guys are trying to find a standard right now, how to make authentication painless and accessible with one framework across different devices. So my key takeaways for you would be, security is something that should matter both to you and your users. Well, we learned that users sometimes don't really learn, and lots of people don't really care. So make it easy for them to authenticate, but make it also easy for them to be secure. Take care of their data, encrypt it nicely, store it nicely, and provide ways for them to come up with better passwords. Educate them. There's a difference between authentication and authorization. So if you want to have a login form, maybe skip certain providers. If you want to have a login and don't really need data, well, then all the OAuth 2 guys are great. And then if you think about security, think about enhancing security and enhancing the user experience, not actually impairing it. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. Security really important for all of us. However, things are evolving really quickly, as you said. If 5 years ago I would have used OpenID, today I would have been screwed as a developer. So how do you advise us to scope with this ever-evolving environment?
I think the issue is that we're running against a windmill, right? There's every time we fought a certain bug and as we squish the bug, a new door opens and a new issue comes up. So the sad answer is we just have to dedicate time to fix our services, to watch what's coming up. There are very simple ways like checking out Hacker News. There are other ways like Security Digest newsletters. So I guess we really have to dedicate some time to it. And obviously, as you said, OpenID for getting identities of users 5 years ago would have been a likely chance. The issue was in 2012, there was an identity hijacking bug in OpenID. So while, let's say, in 2010, it would be a great choice, 2012, definitely a no-go. We have to upgrade our mechanisms and have to keep up with those services. Now, the good thing is, if we move into using SDKs of those popular providers, we obviously also expect them to fix their services and keep them up to date. Google, Facebook, PayPal, all those guys, they hire security guys that take care of security, obviously, as their job. So hopefully their SDKs are a better service than just implementing against an old standard. So I think it really comes down to a lot of work, making it easy to use, and trying to stay up to date with what's coming up. And gladly, like the really bad use cases, like the Heartbleed bug in OpenSSL, gladly are becoming so popular and so publicized that everybody's knowing about it. Same with the iCloud hack that just happened recently. Another one. Yeah?
Hold on a second.
Maybe the mic?
I actually wonder how passwordless authentication actually helps. I mean, how is it better than entering the password once and then using it saved on your secure shared preference, for example? Because you, as I understood, you have to get your email and click on the link every time you want to log in, right?
Absolutely. So the issue is, in a perfect world, our user downloads the app while sitting on a couch using his home Wi-Fi and so on, right? So he's very likely to enter his password in a correct and nice way. The issue is mobile devices are being used on the go, right? So since we, on the one side, want to make sure that our users have secure passwords, so long and very hard to type passwords, how do we make sure that they actually enter it correctly? So if they just provide their email address, which is actually mostly much easier to type, and they get an email, then they can just click on the link, our app opens back in, and we're logged in. So, I didn't hear it, sorry.
Yes. Sorry. The assumption here is that the email client is already authenticated. I mean, he doesn't need to type his email password. But if it's not the case, then it's actually extra burden, right? So, but
yeah.
I understand what you mean.
No, so you definitely shift the security just into another use case, but right. People are more likely to be logged in into Gmail on their Android phone anyway, and same usually with iOS. So I didn't actually encounter too many users that don't use email on their mobile devices. And even then, you could allow them to enter their phone number, which you could pick from the contacts, right? So it's an easier, nicer way. And same applies to emails. You can tap, in Android at least, into the email addresses of the user and let him choose between his 3 emails he's being using on the device. So he actually doesn't really have to type much information into it.
Okay.
So I would say it's a much nicer, probably the best way right now.
But do you have any statistics based on user feedback, anything like that? I mean, is it really working, attracting users? Because I'm not convinced, to be honest. I mean,
well, one way would be the blue ink statistics that we saw before and saying single sign-on is desirable. I guess since passwordless authentication, like it happens right now, is too new, there are not really great statistics saying this is more desirable than two-factor authentication using Google Authenticator or so. So it's a new trend that's just coming up, but I hope to get some more information on it. Anyone else? Other than that, I'll be hanging around downstairs. I'd be happy to have a chat. Thank you.